Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is day 229, October 22nd, 2017, Sunday. In my Sunday morning edition, we'll see how I do. Okay, there's been a lot of talk this week about the release of the last of the Kennedy assassination files. And earlier in the week, we were hearing in the mainstream media reporting that they would probably postpone the release of these Kennedy files because the same reasons they always give us. It's a threat to national security, and it might give out some details about how the CIA works, or you know how we work with security in our embassies and things and such. But it's an old argument. People are really tired of hearing it, and people just want to get the last of this stuff out. And what happened was back in, I guess it was at some point when they first had these Kennedy files locked away, the original time frame was 98 years, I believe. But in 92, was President George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 1, Bush 41, who set a new timetable for the release to be 25 years. Well, that would be this week coming up, would be the end of that period. In fact, October 26th, 2017, which will be coming up here in a few days, would be the date when, if we stick with the timeline of 25 years, we should be releasing the Kennedy assassination files. Now, most of the people who were involved, the high-level people who were involved in the Kennedy assassination and the cover-up that followed, most of those people are dead. Okay? But there are a few, and one specifically, who is still alive, who is up to his eyeballs in the Kennedy assassination. And that would be George Herbert Walker Bush himself. Now, the Bushes are a very, very interesting family. If you ever have a little time on your hands and you want to look into the history of the Bush family, not just going back to George Herbert Walker Bush, but his father, Prescott Bush, and his father, the first of the four generations of Bush family. And there's no question, and I know this upsets a lot of people, but there's no question that if you look at the associations and the ties and the people who the Bushes were involved with, and I think it was more about money than ideology, they were very closely connected to a lot of Nazis. And I'll cover a little bit of that so you know what I mean, but there's much information on that, so I'm not just throwing that out there. It's crazy talk. It's factual, documented evidence that the Bushes, particularly Prescott Bush himself, very closely connected to the Nazis. And remember, Hitler was considered to be a cosmopolitan man back in the mid to late 1930s. He made it on the cover of Time magazine 2 times, and lots of American businessmen liked Hitler because he was building this gigantic war machine, and they were furnishing the material for that. They were making a lot of money off of Adolf Hitler. Now, again, I don't think it was so much ideological as much as it was, money, and business and things like that. But there were, some things about Hitler that that a lot of these Americans liked. He was, a eugenicist, and they kind of liked that. And of course the Bushes were involved with the Sangers, and they were also eugenicists and things and such. And he was a vegetarian, he didn't smoke or drink, and all these sorts of things. So there were these qualities about Hitler that appealed to a lot of American businessmen and high rollers back in the mid to late 30s, and Prescott Bush was, of course, one of them. His father was also, Prescott Bush's father was also there in the early stages of the development of this movement that was happening in Europe, and was even a movement in the United States, but more underground. But I think it was primarily about money and business, but there was some ideologies involved as well. But yes, there was no question that the Bushes, just because Jeb didn't win doesn't mean the Bushes are out of power. The Bushes are still one of the most, if not the most, single most powerful political family in the country. They still have a lot of connection within the deep state. And of course, it was George Herbert Walker Bush that was really proud of the New World Order. He gave various speeches talking about the New World Order and things like that. So the Bushes are highly connected, extremely, very powerful. And they are, specifically George Herbert Walker Bush, the one who stands to have this have the most negative impact on him, and we'll talk about why here in just a minute. But obviously, these files that we're looking at are basically going to release about 3,100 documents that have never been seen by the public, and then there's 30,000 more files that were previously released in a redacted form. And I'm not so sure that this release is going to be 100% completely unredacted sort of releases. I think there will be redactions still in some of these things that will be released. I think there'll be some things that they may not release. So I don't necessarily know that the whole thing is going to be released, but it was quite a turnaround this week, because in the early part of the week, the first like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they were floating these stories that they were going to put a kind of a hold on this and push it back or whatever. But then Trump came out and tweeted out that barring any more information that he might get that might change his mind, barring any of that, his plan was to go ahead and allow the release of these documents, and he should do it. The fact of the matter is, it's been over 50 years. There have been many, many, many documentaries done, many books written, many people have looked into this. I spent years studying the Kennedy assassination, and I think we all know pretty much what happened there. It's not like there's anything that's going to be released. I mean, they're certainly not going to release any documents where it's going to tell the whole story and unveil this great truth about the Kennedy assassination and the cover-up. That's not going to be what we're going to see. But it wouldn't matter. So many of these types of operations, the government will never admit anything like that. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to get the truth. We pretty much know about 90% of the truth of the Kennedy assassination. It's been so thoroughly gone over that it's pretty obvious what was going on and who a lot of the players were, the financiers, the people who carried it out, the people who planned it, the various reasons why it happened, and all that. So there's not a lot of secrets left to be revealed, really, anyway. But just on a matter of principle, yes, they should release the files, and I'm glad that Trump is doing it. I think as a political situation, if I were his political advisor, I would say it's very good for Trump to do. And if he blocked it, I think that would have a very negative impact on him politically. I think a lot of people kind of see him as the people's president, and they think he's on our team. And if he blocked the files releases, I think a lot of people think, uh-oh, he's on the side of the deep state. He's not for us anymore. He's been co-opted and this type of thing. So I think it's would be very negative politically for him to try to block the release, and I think he probably knows that. And again, I don't think there's any great revelations that's really going to come out of it, other than we might learn that there's a little bit more about the CIA involvement. Possibly we'll learn more about exactly what role Lee Harvey Oswald was playing with his association with the FBI and the CIA. But ultimately, I think what bothers the Bush family and scares the Bush family most about this is that if you release this stuff and people start talking about it again and looking into it again, and more people write more books and dig into it again, and we get some real concrete evidence in these releases of the CIA's involvement, you can't look into the CIA's involvement at that period of time in history and not discover the massive role that George Herbert Walker Bush played because of his position in the CIA. George Herbert Walker Bush was basically head of the Southern Hemisphere operations, particularly the area in the Caribbean. He was over the programs that were running like Operation 40, which was this operations to train these Cubans, specifically Cuban assassins, for the purpose of assassinating Castro. And what a lot of people believe is that at least some of the shooters there in Dealey Plaza were shooters that were trained to be these assassins of Fidel Castro. And of course, they simply turned their target instead of Castro to Kennedy. And of course, George Herbert Walker Bush was head of that operation. And the chain of command that was running there in the Caribbean operations was you pretty much had George Herbert Walker Bush. Under him, you had Adlai Phillips. Now, Adlai Phillips was, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald's handler, and we know that. Then under him, you had E. Howard Hunt, and we know about his involvement in his deathbed confession. We'll get to that in a little while. And then, of course, under him, Frank Sturgis. another interesting character who was actually training the commandos on the ground. And of course, we know he's very well known for despising Kennedy, even making comments suggesting he was glad he was killed or whatever, or he's apparently made comments to people that he was involved. And of course, he was seen in Dealey Plaza on the morning of the assassination. Frank Sturgis was there. E. Howard Hunt was there. George Herbert Walker Bush was there in the morning. Then he went to Tyler, Texas, and as the assassination happened, he was actually giving a speech. Then he got right back in his plane and he went back to Houston. And then the following morning, he was summoned to Washington, D.C. for a private meeting. And we'll get back into that in just a moment. But there's no question that if we start dredging up the conversation again and looking into CIA involvement, the name George H.W. Bush is going to come up. It just is. You know, and you can decide as far as, you know, how much involvement he had, but there's no question he was deeply connected to all the major players that were involved in the assassination of Kennedy. No question about it. Now let's talk a little bit about his father, Prescott Bush, who was, of course, at one time a senator. But prior to that, he was the senior director of the Union Bank in New York, which was Hitler's bank in America. Now what happened was in 1940, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, was tasked with the job of rooting out all these American big-time businessmen who were doing business with Hitler and the Nazis. And in the process of doing that, Prescott Bush got caught up in J. Edgar Hoover's dragnet. And he seized the Union Bank and their assets. And in doing so, of course, Prescott Bush objected. And here's a quote from J. Edgar Hoover directly to the face of Prescott Bush. He said, "Sir, you are a Nazi. You run a Nazi bank." That was exactly what J. Edgar Hoover said to Prescott Bush, and it was true. He eventually paid a fine, and that is, of course, available in the public records, and someone pulled it off a microfiche back in the 1970s, because originally Prescott Bush, being a powerful man, was able to keep this quiet for a long time and keep it off the public record, but eventually it showed up in a microfiche somewhere. Somebody found it and published it, and of course you can look at that online. The fine that he paid, he pled guilty to doing business with the Nazis. Also, we had this memo that was released in 1988, and the memo was a memo that Hoover wrote the day, well, I'm not sure the day he wrote the memo, but the memo was about a meeting that happened the day after the assassination. On the day after the assassination, George Herbert Walker Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush went to the office of J. Edgar Hoover, and he was representing the CIA. And this conversation they were going to have about what had just happened the day before. And according to the memo that Hoover wrote, which you can read again, this is online, J. Edgar Hoover wrote a memo released in '88. The memo was about a meeting between the CIA and the FBI about the Kennedy assassination, and the CIA had sent George Herbert Walker Bush to represent them as the CIA officer. Now keep in mind, George Herbert Walker Bush had always denied that he was CIA prior to becoming director in 1974. So this dispels that whole rumor, doesn't it? So Hoover says, in this memo, that George Herbert Walker Bush was directing the anti-Castro Cuban operations. It says that Bush was in charge of the CIA operations in the Southern Hemisphere. And also, again, in that chain of command was Atlee Phillips and Frank Sturgis, as well as E. Howard Hunt. And basically what was going on here was that Bobby Kennedy had learned that these secret training camps were all around the country. Particularly, he learned about the ones in Louisiana, where the CIA was training these Cuban operatives for these anti-Castro operations. And this was all being done without the knowledge of the president. So Bobby Kennedy learned of this, and so he contacted Hoover and said, hey, excuse me. He said, hey, I want you to dig into this and shut down these training camps, these Cuban training camps. And so in an effort to do that, J. Edgar Hoover began investigating this, and he began shutting down these Cuban training camps that the CIA was running, and particularly several of them around the Louisiana area, which is where Lee Harvey Oswald got involved, because Lee Harvey Oswald was running around with a lot of these CIA guys. We'll get back to that in a minute. Now, George Herbert Walker Bush was named by Gerald Ford as the CIA director in 1974. So then he became officially the CIA director. But prior to that, he had been in the CIA since he was a very young man. He got out of the military and went to work directly for the CIA. There's no question about that. Plenty of records to back that up. Plenty of association. He was in business with the CIA's #1 recruiter. His father and his father's best friend were, involved in the very formation of the CIA. So there's no question that George Herbert Walker Bush was CIA for very, very many years before ever becoming the director. We also had a story that was going around a lot back in the early 1980s. I remember very well. There's a liberal journalist named Haynes Johnson. He had some role in the Kennedy administration. I think he was Bobby's press guy, or he was involved with Bobby Kennedy. And he stated in an interview back in the early 80s, I believe it was, Haynes Johnson said he was in the room when Bobby Kennedy said, quote, "Bush's misguided anti-Castro Cubans killed my brother." Bush's misguided anti-Castro Cubans killed my brother. That's what Bobby Kennedy said, according to Haynes Johnson. And again, George Herbert Walker Bush was the head of the Caribbean operations, including this Operation 40, which of course involved D. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, and a lot of people believe that one or two of the assassination teams that were in Dealey Plaza on that morning that participated in the assassination, and we know Sturgis was there, as well as a couple other Cubans that were very well known to a lot of people. They were all there in Dallas that morning, so it just it's not too hard to put two and two together to see that some of these characters that were part of this Operation 40 under George Herbert Walker Bush were heavily and deeply involved in the actual shooting and the operation that morning to kill Kennedy. No question about it. Again, we don't need any CIA releases or any new releases to know this. This is all factual information, documented witnesses. People saw these guys there. People know who they were before that. This is all very much public information and has been for a very long time. So basically, George Herbert Walker Bush played a key role, of course, in the failed Bay of Pigs operation, because these Cuban operations were happening. He was the senior man. A lot of people look at Sturgis and Hunt and the CIA in general, Dulles and all those, but it was really George Herbert Walker Bush, as head of Caribbean operations, that was instrumental in the arming and the planning of the Bay of Pigs event. Now, as we all know from history, that when Kennedy failed to send in the Air Force in support to the Cubans who hit the beach that morning and allowed the mission to fail, these people despised Kennedy as a result of that, including Dulles, the head of the CIA, of course, George Herbert Walker Bush, who was running the Caribbean operations. It was his operation that got blown up. See, a lot of people point to Dulles and a lot of people who got fired. Of course, all three top guys at the CIA were fired, but not George Herbert Walker Bush. He was not really pinned as the guy, but he was really the operational guy running things on the ground. He wasn't one of the senior figureheads, one of the top three, or he would have been fired. But he survived the firings, but it was definitely his plan, working along with Hunt and Sturgis. They were the ones who were really the hands-on people on the ground, training these Cubans, setting up this operation. So we all know that. And so this is another reason why George Herbert Walker Bush, along with Dulles and Cabell and all these other guys, despised Kennedy and wanted him dead. And it should be no surprise that George Herbert Walker Bush would have been part of this cabal with these other individuals to kill Kennedy. And whether or not George Bush gave the direct order for these Cubans to change their target from Castro to Kennedy is not something we're probably ever going to learn. As far as we're not going to get a document that's going to say, yeah, George Bush is the one who directed Sturgis and Hunt to tell these Cubans, hey, instead of trying to hit Castro, we're going to hit Kennedy. I don't think you're going to find that in these releases, but there's enough evidence when you look at all the players and everything that was going on to know that it certainly didn't happen without him knowing about it. Certainly George Herbert Walker Bush had to have known about this. And it's also, when you look at other associations that he had with the financiers, certainly George Herbert Walker Bush had to know this was going down. We also know by some of the actions he took afterwards that he certainly had to know, and as part of the cover-up operations. Let's also remember that a couple other things that explain why George Herbert Walker Bush and how protective he is and how protective the Bush family is of these particular secrets that they don't want people talking about. They want people to forget all about this, which is why they are the #1 political family and political people in the country who do not want to see these releases. Let's not forget that E. Howard Hunt, after being involved in all of those Cuban operations and the assassination of Kennedy, and he talked about this in his deathbed confession, he talks about the fact that it was a CIA operation. It was called the Big Event. He was there, and his role that morning was to be a bench warmer. I do believe he was one of those 3 hobos that were caught on the train. And so he admits to all this. But let's not forget that E. Howard Hunt was also involved in the Watergate burglary. He was found in the Watergate Hotel with a couple of the Cubans and a couple other people, and they were the ones who broke into the Watergate. Now, when E. Howard Hunt was in jail over the Watergate arrests, he sent through a third party, he sent a message to Richard Nixon basically saying, hey buddy, if you don't get me $2 million and get me out of jail, I'm going to tell everything I know about the Kennedy assassination. Basically is what E. Howard Hunt did to put pressure. And guess who came up with the money? Well, George Herbert Walker Bush was so terrified by the fact that Hunt might start talking, and of course their relationship being very close, that he got his best friend, a very wealthy man, best friend and business partner of George Herbert Walker Bush. Bush got Mr. Bill Likey to meet that $2 million demand of E. Howard Hunt. So E. Howard Hunt got his $2 million, and he got it from Bush's best friend. Then, of course, we have the strange incident with Mr. De Morganshield. De Morganshield, of course, was a close friend of George Herbert Walker Bush, also active in CIA operations in the Southern Hemisphere. And, of course, he was Oswald's mentor. He was the guy who got Oswald the job at the Texas School Book Depository. He had gone over and had many conversations with Oswald and was sort of mentoring him. And he did a TV interview after the assassination because people knew about his close association with Oswald. And in that interview, which you can watch on YouTube, he said that Oswald was liked Kennedy, really liked Kennedy, was a supporter of Kennedy, and was anti-communists. Of course, this was probably didn't fit very well with the narrative, and then shortly after that, and the night before Mr. De Morganshield was set to testify before the Warren Commission, he took a shotgun to the head. Someone shot him in the head with a shotgun, killed him. And in his wallet, they found a piece of paper with some names and addresses on it. One of those names was George Herbert Walker Bush, Poppy Bush, with his name, address, and phone number. There's no question that George Herbert Walker Bush was directly involved in the planning, the execution, and the cover-up of JFK. And that's why the powerful Bush family is putting a lot of pressure on the CIA and other people behind the scenes to stop this release. And again, the Bushes still hold a lot of power, and I'm sure that they're going to put a lot of pressure on Trump over the next few days to try to get him to stop this release. But at this point, based on his most recent tweet, we can believe that we are going to get the release of the JFK files. And as I said, I don't believe there'll be any major thing going on here other than it will sort of reignite the issue, and it may show some more involvement of the CIA, possibly even the FBI. We might learn some things, but what it's going to do more than anything else is reconjure up this talking about this assassination, and it may, of course, get people to start talking about the role of the CIA. And it's a very simple fact: if you start talking about the role of the CIA in the JFK assassination, you are going to stumble on to George Herbert Walker Bush and the key role that he probably did play in the assassination. And I think that's what has a lot of the deep state people, CIA, and particularly the Bushes, concerned about the release. Because most of the other key players are dead, but George Herbert Walker Bush is still alive. It also implicates his father as well. So anyway, I think that's it. As far as what we may learn about Oswald or the FBI or anything else, they talk about his trips to Mexico and blah, 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 blah. Well, whether he took trips to Mexico, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. There's some video footage of that. And the guy that they're showing as being Lee Harvey Oswald didn't look anything like Lee Harvey Oswald to me. So we know that they were using a lot of body doubles for Lee Harvey Oswald when they were sheep dipping him to be the patsy. I think my take on this has always been is that we learned a long time ago that Lee Harvey Oswald was involved with a lot of players who were involved in these Cuban operations in the CIA. We know he was down in New Orleans working alongside with Ferry and some of these other people who were involved in these Cuba operations, Sturgis and the like. But we also learned from two different sources, including the Attorney General of Texas, when he basically said it on camera, that they had learned that Lee Harvey Oswald was on the payroll of the FBI. His handler was a man named James Hosey or something to that effect. James Hosty, FBI agent. He was Oswald's handler at the FBI. Oswald was being paid $200 a month. And he was being paid $200 a month because he was one of Hoover's boys. Hoover actually talked about Oswald 3 years before the assassination in a memo he wrote. What Oswald was doing was the FBI had noticed that Oswald was running around with these CIA characters who were involved in training these Cubans. He was involved with Ferry, Guy Bannister, and some of these other characters. And so they recruited Lee Harvey Oswald from the FBI counterintelligence to give them information about these secret training camps that he was privy to. So this is what Oswald was doing for the FBI. He was hanging out with his CIA buddies, going to these Cuban training camps, and they figured out, eventually the CIA figured out that every time Oswald was taken to one of these training camps, a couple days later, the FBI came in and shut him down and busted him. So eventually I think the CIA figured out that Oswald was playing both sides of the coin and was kind of turning on them, and he wasn't their boy, he was the FBI's boy. And I think that's why they selected him to be the patsy, to be set up. And I think that Hoover figured this out as well. Hoover figured out that the CIA found out who his little mole was, Lee Harvey Oswald, and of course this was a retribution against Hoover and against Lee Harvey Oswald, which is why he was selected as the patsy. We don't need any new information from the JFK files to be released to tell us this. We know this. This is public information, public knowledge. So again, I think it's the right thing to do, release the files. I don't think we'll get any smoking guns or anything like that. I think it'll reconjure up the conversation. It may direct some attention toward the CIA. Certainly, I think that, everything else we know, we have 90% of this puzzle solved. And I think most people know that it was a operation to assassinate the president, carried out by many high-level players, the CIA, FBI, Secret Service, all involved. Of course, the Bushes' deep involvement in all that. So I just don't think it's going to change a whole lot. It'll create some energy in the JFK thing for a few weeks, maybe a few months, and it'll all go away again. But yeah, they should just get it out and get it over with, and they should have a long time ago. But I don't expect anything major to come out, and I think it's the right thing politically to do for President Trump to go ahead and allow the release of the documents. So that's pretty much my take on the JFK files and what's going to happen with that. So anyway, that's my take on it, and thanks for tuning in. And I'll be back Monday. Thanks, guys. Bye.